And this is the anniversary. I mean, we're hitting the anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union. So this is a really important time to talk about what all of this means, because the role that U.S. communists and U.S. leftists played at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, the way politics in Russia kind of played out in the early 90s is really important to understand. This term red-brown alliance that we hear being so widely used, it goes back to this time. This term Nazbol, National Bolshevik, it goes back to this time as well. So I think we should just, dig right into it and get down to what happened. So in the 1980s, the Soviet Union had a lot of problems in the 1980s. It was pretty clear. Now, their economy was still, growing at a certain substantial rate, but they needed to reform. They needed to change. And the way the Soviet Union had developed, there wasn't public debate. You have to remember, this was a country that had been surrounded. After the Russian Revolution, like 15 countries invaded. Millions of people died in the Russian Civil War. Then you had World War II, another invasion where like 27 million people died. And the Soviet Union was a very, very authoritarian place. And, we talk about the concept of democratic centralism, which meant that debates and disagreements inside the Communist Party were kept internal. Average people weren't being told about them. It was only within the party that the debates were taking place. So publicly, it looked like the Soviet Communist Party were all on the same page. They put out a very clear message. We believe in Marxism, Leninism, etc. But beneath the surface, there was a big divide in the Soviet Communist Party. And the divide was basically, you had one faction that was becoming more and more pro-Western, more and more pro-American, led by Gorbachev. And they basically felt that the Soviet Union needed to transition to become kind of a welfare state, like Norway or Sweden. And they were convinced that the United States would let them do that. If they were to give up the Soviet state, kind of restore a capitalist model, but hold on to some welfare state programs like free healthcare, that would be the best thing. And then there was another wing that was increasingly critical of the United States, felt the United States was their enemy, but they were framing things up not in a Marxist way, but in a more traditionalist and conservative way. The Russian Orthodox Church was brought back. It was actually during the Second World War. Stalin re-legalized the Russian Orthodox Church, and there started to be more of a conservative Russian Orthodox narrative among what you can call the hardliners. And American media and American intelligence picked up on this immediately. And if you read the U.S. media during that time, the New York Times, they would talk about the reformers like Gorbachev and the hardliners like Brezhnev or Andropov.
That's how I remember learning about this in like school.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, there was an article that was talking about an argument between these two and used that exact same framing. I can't remember what the article was at the moment. It was a month or two ago.
But Gorbachev was like the good guy.
Yeah, Gorbachev was the good guy, and the hardliners, as you have pointed out, Caleb, were the bad guy.
Right, and basically the operation of American intelligence was to do everything it could to prop up Gorbachev, to help the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party. One great example of that is 1988. There was a TV special on American television and on Soviet television. It was called Free to Be a Family. And it was a joint broadcast in English and Russian with the Muppets. It was a show for children promoting single motherhood, because at the time, there was a rise in single motherhood in the Soviet Union. And the more conservative hardliner wing was saying, no, we need to preserve the Soviet family. We need strong families to have a strong country. Whereas the more Western-oriented Gorbachev wing was saying, well, no, we need to be more modern. This is women gaining more freedom, et cetera. So the U.S., not the U.S. government, but ABC, a major TV network, and a whole lot of, U.S. TV stars, Robin Williams, Bon Jovi, the Muppets, others did this whole broadcast. It was basically a way to promote the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, which was basically favoring dismantling the Soviet Union and kind of reaching an alliance or an agreement with the United States in order to do so. This was a method of covertly propping them up.
Yeah, this was one of the things that I wanted to really make an explicit comparison with BreadTube with that broadcast, because that broadcast, I don't think that it's good to have an economic coercion that forces a specific mode of family a la Engels, but it comes as kind of the sugar that makes the medicine go down in terms of the Western agenda here, because it props up the wing of the Communist Party, which is overall basically trying to dismantle all of the various gains that the Soviet Union had made over the previous regime.
Right. And it came with this idea that the United States was a paradise. And I mean, I've talked to many people who went over to the Soviet Union in their final years, and there was widespread belief in the Soviet Union that the USA was just this land of milk and honey where everyone was happy. And if you tried to talk to people about, racism in the United States, poverty in the United States, police brutality, people would roll their eyes and say, oh, yeah, that's just propaganda from the government. There was a lot of confusion.
Well, there are no cats in America.
What?
Do you remember the American Tail, the Fievel movie?
Right. And it was just, it had a lot to do with, what we now associate with the synthetic left, rock and roll music, blue jeans, hippie counterculture. The United States was seen as this land of artistic freedom and such. And we know the CIA subsidized, like the work of Jackson Pollock, for example. There's decades of this, and the CIA subsidizing American art and culture in a way that would kind of give the impression this country was a lot more tolerant and free than it really was. And that this was going on, and that there were, especially among the most privileged people in Soviet society, like the children of Communist Party bureaucrats who lived a much more comfortable life than average Russians and average people in the Soviet Union, there was this belief that the United States was just this paradise, this land of freedom, etc. And that the idea that the United States had a history of racism, the idea that the United States was going around waging wars, and there were people here living in extreme poverty, that was all just kind of Soviet government propaganda. And this was a huge effort to kind of cultivate a wing of the Soviet Communist Party that would have these illusions about the United States. And a lot of, I guess you can say this, what we call the synthetic left or liberals had a role in that. One story that I heard that was very hilarious is somebody said, they said, we hear in the United States, you have a very small Communist Party. It has only 1 million members.
Yeah.
That's hilarious because the CPUSA has never had anything close to 1 million.
What is the actual membership of CPUSA?
In the 1930s, they maybe had, maybe almost 100,000 in the 1930s. But since the end of World War II, it's never been over 10,000. For example, you'll often hear Noam Chomsky quoted. They'll refer to Noam Chomsky as the most quoted source in the English language after the Bible. That's true. That was true during the Soviet years because he was quoted in Soviet media, in Soviet-aligned media all throughout the world. They would quote Noam Chomsky because he was an American intellectual who was somebody who put out critique of U.S. foreign policy. But Noam Chomsky was very obscure in the United States. If you weren't an activist or a linguist academic, you'd never heard of Noam Chomsky. But in the Soviet Union, a lot of people believed Noam Chomsky was a household name, that every American was reading Noam Chomsky. He was on the TV news every night or something. There was just this confusion about that. And it was all about kind of creating the idea that, okay, sure, there is anti-communism in the United States, but it only comes from Ronald Reagan. It only comes from the right. But the Democrats, they're your friends, and they want everyone to get along. And Bernie Sanders, we saw during the recent election, the New York Times did this big hit piece on Bernie Sanders for the fact that he went over to the Soviet Union and was talking with the KGB and all of that. But that was part of creating the illusion, right? Bernie Sanders is very much an outlier in American politics, right? But he was going over there and had a sister city in I think it was Belarus. It was like Minsk was the sister. And, playing up the idea that, look, there's this whole wing of the U.S. power structure that is your friends, guys. And you can throw in the towel. You can surrender in the Cold War. And we won't mess with you. We'll be all right. We'll let you turn into Norway or Sweden. And that'll all be good. And that was that part of that, that was really a big factor in winning the Cold War. Fox News and the right wing like to say it was all because of Reagan's arms race escalation. Well, that took an economic toll on the Soviet Union for sure. But it was this, ideological penetration, this kind of soft power penetration that really laid the basis for it. And, other socialist countries learned from it. Probably the biggest problem was they couldn't have open debate because it was a very authoritarian society. You couldn't openly debate these things. So these conversations were all kind of in the back room. They were all kind of whispered. And because of that, you didn't know where everyone stood. And that created a situation where a lot of disinformation could get into the former Soviet Union.
That lent very much to the situation that was sort of talked about in the films of Adam Curtis, hypernormalization is about the disinformation in the Soviet Union. And I think that part of the big problem, like he asserts that it's just this evil scheme to to control the population. But I think what you're talking about, in my opinion anyway, contributes pretty heavily to that environment. It's funny, you point out like various connections between capitalists and you're an anti-Semite, according to like people who say the word conspiracy theory. But to me, and this is where it comes from too, you have your democratic centralism putting that public face forward where everybody has the same opinion. So people make assumptions like they're all attempting to push the same thing. And so it's all must be part of the plan. And it's not.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, originally the Soviet Union, when it was formed, had three political parties. There were three political parties that recognized the Soviet Constitution: the Bolsheviks, the left Mensheviks, and the left Socialist Revolutionary Party. And then they fought a civil war against the other political parties that didn't recognize that constitution. But then a member of the left Socialist Revolutionary Party shot Vladimir Lenin. And the Menshevik Party was also involved in that. So both those parties were outlawed, as they were seen as kind of a place that conspirators would move. And everyone who really supported the Bolsheviks moved into the Bolshevik Party. And then you had Lenin coming out and actually banning factions in the Bolshevik Party, right? Because I mean, at this point, the country's been invaded by 15 different countries. They're facing a barricade. They can't get basic medical supplies. And in the face of that, you have to kind of have a rigid authoritarian, development.
You have to lock down.
Yeah, and that's what they were doing. And then you have to add to the fact that, people talk a lot about the Kronstadt revolt. Well, what was the Kronstadt revolt? That was this anarchist uprising against the Bolsheviks. What was it about? Well, it was these sailors in Kronstadt who, when they were trying to centralize, like have a central military authority, they said, oh no, they said, we want Soviets without communists. We don't want there to be any central authority. Well, if you're fighting off an invasion by 15 different countries, you're going to need to have central authority. And they took up guns against the Bolsheviks at that point, and the Bolsheviks really had no choice but to put it down. It was considered a great tragedy because these were their comrades, revolutionaries, but they needed to centralize to defeat, the foreign attack. But then, you fast forward and just about 20 years later, you have World War II, 27 million people killed when the Nazis invaded. And a country that's under those kind of conditions is going to become more rigid and authoritarian. And, we know about there was a lot of fear, and we don't know exactly. I don't think anyone knows exactly what was going on. But, there were the Moscow trials where there were a lot of people that were very high up in the Soviet government that were arrested and charged with having been involved in a Nazi conspiracy against the government. And at that point, a lot of average people in the Soviet Union got the memo, stay out of politics, right? That politics is not a safe place to go, right? That, if you want to just live your life, that's fine. But if you get involved in politics, it could get messy. And so a lot of average people in the Soviet Union were not very politicized. And that kind of set the stage for what happened later with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was that there was not open political debate happening at the time. And it's funny because if you go to Cuba now, and if you go to socialist countries now, they've learned from this. There is a big effort to bring people into political debate. In Cuba, there are anti-communists, and they don't, drag them away in the middle of the night. In fact, what they do is they have the population argue with them, and local people in the community will get up and debate them and argue against them. And you can see what's happening with the Bolivarian circles in Venezuela and the citizens' power councils in Nicaragua. There's an understanding that if you create an atmosphere where people are afraid to speak up, where there's just kind of a chill effect, that in the long term doesn't help socialism, even though you might feel it's necessary temporarily. And it's interesting to see how all of this has adjusted. But, in the 1980s, there was a lot of confusion in the Soviet Union because they needed to change. The way they were operating in their economy, it needed to change. I think they probably needed to do something like what China did and have some market reforms, have like a market sector to help strengthen socialism. But they were very rigid in the way that they were set up. And so you had one wing of the party that was saying, that we need to continue to maintain a socialist economy, but then starting to view things more in a conservative, traditionalist, and orthodox way. And then you have another wing of the party that is saying, well, we can become like a Western social democratic country. Now, one thing I want to add, and this is really important, is that that some of these more conservative voices in the Communist Party were talking about the Russian Empire. And when we hear empire, what do we think? We think imperialism, right? Well, you really ought to go see, if you have a chance, there's a great movie made during World War II called Ivan the Terrible. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's one of the most famous Soviet movies. Sergei Eisenstein made this movie, and it's about a czar from hundreds of years ago, and he's the czar who unified Russia. And there's a reason that the Bolsheviks during World War II made this movie about Ivan the Terrible, because Ivan the Terrible, he was terrible. He was a strong authoritarian leader, but he brought all of those countries in that region together. He made them all together. And as a result of that, living standards were able to go up. And that's when you got things like education. And that's when you got things like infrastructure. And it was the beginning of modern Russia. It's very similar with China. In China, there is this adamant, they are adamant. They get very fired up about Taiwan. They get very fired up about Hong Kong and Tibet, because the way China was kept poor was by keeping it divided, right? When you had Tibet separate, Uyghur regions separate, you had Hong Kong separate, you had Taiwan separate. That was a way that China was kept poor. But one unified China, that has always been something that has made the country stronger, right? And that in China and in Russia and in the Eurasian, the Eurasian hemisphere, where you have a lot of landlocked areas, you don't have a lot of access to the ocean. Generally, conditions are better when countries are unified, when the peoples of that region, different ethnic groups, different religions, different nationalities, when they are working together and trading with each other instead of fighting each other, that's when things get better. And you'll notice that, U.S. intelligence knows this as well. It's big. The main CIA.
I know where you're going with this.
Just kill all white people.
Yeah.
Brzezinski wrote a whole book at the time, in the 90s after the Soviet Union had fallen. And it was about basically how to maintain U.S. hegemony over Eurasia. And what he wrote was, he said, in order to dominate Eurasia, we have to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. He wrote that. He said that.
Yep.
The idea of playing Christians against Muslims, right? Because you have, Russia is the biggest non-Muslim country in terms of Muslims. No non-Muslim country has more Muslims in it than Russia does. There's a lot of Muslims in Russia, right? But playing Muslims against Christians, playing different nationalities against each other, this is how you tear down Eurasia. But when people are unified, that's when you have economic development. So you had some of these more conservative forces saying, well, the idea of a quote unquote Russian empire is good for the region, meaning it will lead to economic development. And they're not framing this in terms of socialism and Marxism, but more in terms of Eurasia versus the West, the Atlanticist, ocean-based model versus the landlocked Eurasian hemisphere.
You basically have two factions of the Communist Party drifting away from Marxism in two different directions.
Right. One is becoming westernized and liberal. The other is becoming traditionalist, conservative, and Eurasianist, I guess. So, as the crisis happens, right, you remember what happened. So Gorbachev was continuing to liberalize the Soviet Union, more market reforms. He's bringing non-communists into the government, et cetera. And so then the hardliners arrested him, and they called it the coup, and he was arrested. And at that point, there were people protesting. Eventually, the hardliners released Gorbachev, and then the Soviet Union was dissolved. And when the Soviet Union was dissolved, it was one of the biggest economic catastrophes in history. I mean, it was a disaster. And this is one of the arguments that just drives me up the wall. People always say communism failed, communism never achieved anything. The aftermath of the Soviet Union, when they took, socialism and ripped it up and created capitalism, it is a nightmare. I mean, it was an economic disaster. Naomi Klein writes about it in her book, The Shock Doctrine. Philip Thayer wrote a very good book on it called Europe Since 1989. The life expectancy dropped very significantly. The infant mortality rate shot up. Mass unemployment, something like 30% unemployment. Can you imagine 30% unemployment? The 1990s in Russia was not doing well economically. And basically, what they had been told at the time that the Soviet Union was being dissolved was that, the United States was just going to let the Soviet Union transition to being a welfare state. That's not what happened. The Soviet Union got economically demolished. And I mean, we're talking, this is, the term used by Andre Gunder Frank, the US economist, he called it economic genocide because the population of Russia went down by 10% during this time. Now, it wasn't all deaths. Some of it was just people leaving. But it was, when the population of a country drops by 10% amid an economic collapse, that's bad. And that was what was happening in Russia at that time. And it was all of the illusions that the kind of the Gorbachev wing of the Communist Party and the supporters of Boris Yeltsin had this illusion that somehow Russia would be allowed to transition to a more liberal system and continue to flourish economically. It was completely debunked. But the Western left was part of cultivating those illusions. right? And that's a very important thing to talk about. The Communist Party of the United States, was probably the main back channel that U.S. intelligence used to funnel this kind of disinformation into the Soviet Union. There's a very important book called Operation Solo that's written about Morris Childs. And Morris Childs was an FBI agent who infiltrated the Communist Party for the FBI. And he smuggled money into the United States and gave it to the Communist Party leaders, in suitcases, basically. And he was an FBI informer. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan for his work infiltrating the Communist Party. Now, back to the United States. In the lead up to the fall of the Soviet Union, all kinds of communists all over the world are saying something's wrong here, right? Gorbachev gets up and says he doesn't believe in Marxism anymore. He doesn't believe in class struggle. He believes in, quote, universal human values. He gets up and says Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are good people and the Soviet Union likes them, and he's, everyone around the world is kind of raising the alarm bells. All British communists are speaking up. Dissident American communists are speaking up. Everyone's speaking up. The Communist Party of the United States says nothing about it. They just applaud it. And there was never any awareness about what was happening until the last minute. And at the last minute, when Gorbachev was arrested in the coup, at the last minute, Gus Hall finally came out and said, something's wrong. Gus Hall was the leader of the U.S. Communist Party, a longtime labor activist. He finally came out and said, okay, something is wrong. And at that moment, a number of members of the Communist Party immediately quit. I mean, there was mass resignations from the Communist Party. And a couple of years later, like 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had their national convention in Cleveland, Ohio. And at least half the membership walked out of the convention, including Angela Davis and a number of these people who were basically people who didn't believe in communism. They believed in kind of the social democratic liberalism. And it's apparent that they were being used by American intelligence to kind of cultivate a social democratic and liberal illusion among the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And, that is certainly a sore point for the Communist Party, the role that they played, the fact that the fall of the Soviet Union took them by surprise, and then a number of their members quit in support of Gorbachev. That's pretty big.
Yeah, it cut them all the way down to 500,000 members.
Well, just in the example of Angela Davis, you can see how her views transform over time.
It's interesting because, and I've talked about this too, the Communist Party, they did take the position of voting for the Democrats, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason they took that position was the feeling was the Democrats, they wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union. They wanted to sign, nuclear treaties, et cetera. And that Ronald Reagan and the escalation of the arms race was like the main threat. But that started out as a tactic. Supporting Roosevelt, in a popular front against fascism in the 1930s was a tactic, right? They did it not because they thought Roosevelt was a good guy, but it was a strategic decision that they made.
A means to an end.
Yeah, but what started out as a tactic kind of became a law because, it started out as a tactic for the grandparents, but then their parents just did that. They didn't know anything different. And now the people running the Communist Party, like Joe Sims, they've never done anything other than campaign for the Democrats. It's all they know how to do. In the 1930s, the Communist Party was very much a labor militant party. It was the party of militant labor activists, of black revolutionary intellectuals, etc. But, from about the 1960s onward, it becomes almost, I jokingly call it like the Soviet lobby. That often what would happen is you'd have like college kids, they'd go on a trip to Cuba because they want, adventure. They want to go to visit a socialist country. So they go to Cuba and they're blown away by the achievements of socialism and, free education and healthcare and workers running the factories and such. And so they find out that, that if they really want to help Cuba, when they come back to the United States, they ought to join this group called the Communist Party. So they join the Communist Party. What does the Communist Party do? It campaigns like hell for the local Democrats. And it operates in secret, but it's made clear to the local Democrat that, hey, we're communists and we're campaigning like hell for you. And the idea is local Democrats will see this and say, wow, by golly, these communists have worked so hard for my campaign. Maybe I should, be lighter on the Soviet Union or something like that. It's kind of a failed strategy. And people compare it to almost how Israel lobbies, right? You have birthright trips to Israel. People go to Israel. They really like Israel. They get back to the United States, and then they're kind of plugged into like pro-Israeli activism in the United States, right? That's not what the Communist Party was intended to be. That's not what it was in the time of Lenin and Stalin, but that's what it kind of became. And the Black Panthers are kind of an exception to that. See, originally, the Communist Party denounced the Black Panthers as left adventurous terrorists when they first started doing their armed patrols, around police brutality. The Communist Party was freaked out and thought they were FBI provocateurs. But then after Richard Nixon was elected and COINTELPRO came down hard on the Communist Party and the Black Panthers were kind of fighting for their lives, essentially, being targeted by the FBI. At that point, the Black Panthers had a convention in California and entered an alliance with the Communist Party. And suddenly, that's when Angela Davis became friendly to the Black Panthers. And you had the Black Panthers and the Communist Party in like late 1969. They're cooperating with each other in response to heavy political repression from Richard Nixon. And that the Black Panther, Angela Davis, that was kind of the exception. The Communist Party behaved in a very reformist manner, but, Angela Davis, put on trial and acquitted in a very widely publicized trial. And then she had her committee against political repression and racism. And other than, some of their activism in terms of Black liberation was bold and revolutionary. But in a lot of ways, the Communist Party kind of functioned as this kind of liberal, this kind of group of liberals that lobbied in defense of the Soviet Union and were trying to convince Democrats that the Soviet Union wasn't so bad. And that was kind of the role that they played. And I think that led to a lot of confusion, I guess you could say. But also going on during this time, and again, we're coming at this from so many different angles here, was the anti-nuclear movement. And this is really important also. So nuclear power in the United States is tied up with the production of nuclear weapons, right? It's linked to each other. And it tends to be the military-industrial complex that favors nuclear power. Whereas the main opponent of nuclear power in the United States is the oil companies, because nuclear power will put them out of business, right? So there's kind of a divide with, the Rockefellers and the Ford Foundation. And, a lot of those folks are very opposed to nuclear power. They're also very opposed to the military-industrial complex, and they're funneling money to the CIA. So you have the CIA and big oil, on the one side, opposing nuclear weapons, opposing nuclear power. You have the military-industrial complex favoring an escalation with the Soviet Union, supporting nuclear power, supporting a nuclear arms race. There's kind of a division. And so you have the anti-nuclear movement that emerges. And in like the late 70s, during the Carter administration, suddenly you have people protesting against nuclear power. After the 3 Mile Island incident, and then later you have Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, you start having protests against nuclear power. And at first, the Communist Party says, okay, we're not against nuclear power. We just want public ownership of it. We don't trust private companies, which is probably the correct position.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the way you would want that to go.
Right. We can't trust private companies with the health of the public. But, the idea that there's something inherently wrong with nuclear energy, that's not Marxism, right? People getting up, you can't play God by splitting an atom. That's not Marxism, right?
That's silly idealism.
Right. But, the Communist Party eventually backs down from that position and just goes all in against nuclear power, because there's a feeling that Ronald Reagan and the military-industrial complex are the main threat. And so in the Soviet Union, you start having marches against nuclear power and against nuclear weapons sponsored by the Soviet Communist Party, by the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, by the government, on the same day as you have rallies in the United States against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And these marches basically equate the Soviet government and their nukes with the American government and their nukes. And it's kind of creating this idea that, we're on both sides are to blame, right? And that becomes a big liberal mobilization. And it's kind of an anti-science mobilization. It's saying there's something inherently wrong with nuclear energy. It's kind of Malthusian, right? We need to get back to Mother Nature. We need to get back.
Exactly. We always have to return to Monkey. When we get into that stuff, it's the Ann-Prim crap, the anarcho-primitivist crap, the antinatalists, all these, just basically anti-human people will always come together and advocate for a form of austerity in opposition to what is somehow an evil force, which in the 1980s, like you said, is nuclear.
Yeah, and so you had this situation where the Gorbachev wing of the Communist Party that was becoming more and more reformist, and the U.S. Communist Party and leftists in the United States are basically playing off of each other in a way that ultimately leads to the dismantling of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union falls. The Communist Party wrote this big, long article trying to link me to Dugin, trying to, say that I'm a continuation of this. And this is a way to try and gloss over their history, because so immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, Gus Hall, the longtime leader of the Soviet Union, he did denounce Gorbachev. And they did, at that point, all the people that were supporting Gorbachev, which was like almost the majority of the Communist Party, quit. And they published some very good books. They published a book called Socialism Betrayed by Roger Kieran, which is an analysis of the fall of the Soviet Union. They published another book called Heroic Struggle and Bitter Defeat. And they did kind of recognize that this Gorbachev wing had been revisionist, I guess you could say, and had led to the downfall. But Gus Hall died. Gus Hall died in the year 2000. And his successor, Sam Webb, immediately allowed all the people who had resigned at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and the convention afterwards, let them all back into the party. So the Communist Party's leadership now is full of people who quit around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's a really important thing. And
you support this social democracy version of communism rather than a Marxist.
Well, rather than a Marxist, Leninist viewpoint is really the key here, because what is ostensibly the Marxist-Leninist Party of the United States isn't.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's been very clear. I mean, I've known people over the years. That's why I think it's funny when they claim I sent people in to infiltrate their party. I never did that, because I've known people for years who joined the Communist Party and been utterly disappointed and quit. There were people who came to me and they said, "Hey, Caleb, I love your broadcast. I'm joining the Communist Party." I never told them not to, but I was just like, well, join at your own risk. I mean, what I told them. Because, I mean, for years, people have said the Communist Party, they join. You go to a meeting once a month, and you go into a room, and it's and you eat donuts and coffee with a lot of people that are significantly over the age of 60, and you talk about what Democrats you campaigned for this week, and what
you talk about how wonderful it is that Kamala is the vice president now.
What the fuck was that?
Yeah, I know, that was just.
Right. And I've had a lot of people who say that when they join, they're like, maybe there's another meeting, like where they have
there's like a real meeting.
And they'll actually ask, like, so when do I get invited to like the real communist?
Yeah. When do we get to do some communist stuff?
Right. You don't. I mean, that's kind of in the aftermath of the election of Barack Obama. I mean, for a long time, the Communist Party was almost like a secret society. You never saw them handing out their paper. They were just like this, someone might whisper if you're in an anti-war protest, that person's in the Communist Party. But it wasn't, in the immediate aftermath of Barack Obama's election, suddenly they got the memo. It was okay to have literature again. So you'd see them passing out like leaflets and newspapers. But it all kind of led to this, we have to support the Democrats because the Republicans are fascist, the Republicans are Nazis.
And the Democrats totally aren't.
Yeah, the Democrats totally aren't. Fascism has nothing to do with like
the economic base.
The state of the economy or anything like that. It's just some aesthetic crap that you can read about in an Umberto Eco essay.
Right. And the thing is that at this logic, at the end of the day, I mean, it came from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union felt like the Democrats wanted to negotiate with them. The Republicans wanted to escalate the arms race, which hurt their economy significantly. So the orientation from the Soviet Union was oppose the military-industrial complex. And if there's a mobilization in U.S. society against the military-industrial complex, like the anti-nuclear movement, et cetera, join it because it's pushing back against Reagan and all of that. But that orientation really didn't take into account that at the end of the day, the Democrats were almost the more effective evil. Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The arms race was not going to destroy the Soviet Union. It caused them problems, but it wasn't going to destroy it. It was cultivating the Gorbachev wing and sowing those illusions. And, I used to see, I heard when I was in college, and I rolled my eyes at the time, but it was true. But they would say things like, the Soviet Union wasn't brought down by Reagan. It was brought down by Beatles music and blue jeans. That's true, actually. Western consumerism. And
absolutely
cultivating this delusion of the United States and cultivating a layer of people who claimed they were against communism and against Western capitalism. They were just part of this Western liberal milieu. Think for
the Three Arrows thing.
Yeah, the Three Arrows people. Exactly.
Yeah, that was key in bringing down the Soviet Union. At the time that the Soviet Union was brought down, a lot of the college kids who went out to protest in support of Yeltsin and Gorbachev, if you asked them, do you believe in socialism? They would have said yes. They would have said, yes, I believe in socialism. I just want more human rights. I want to be able to, paint the kind of pictures I want. I want to be able to go to the library and read books that are against what the party wants. They didn't realize. They were under the impression they could keep their guaranteed job, keep their guaranteed health care, keep their guaranteed education, but then also gain the ability to shop at Walmart and listen to punk rock albums and watch movies, made by who's the guy who painted the soup cans? What's his name? The Warhol, and it was like there was this whole like hippie milieu that was cultivated among the Soviet Communist Party's leadership, and among especially the intellectuals, the artists, the filmmakers, the scientists, the engineers, people like that. They were kind of cultivated to believe they weren't moving against socialism. They weren't tools of the United States. They were the third camp. And this is a really common, you get this from up to now, the DSA.
I mean, if you asked Agent Thorne if she was pro-imperialism and anti-socialism, she'd likely say no.
Right.
Yeah, she's for the third way, this magical third way. Well, and that there's, they spent decades working on this. For example, there was a program starting in the 1950s called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the CIA bragged about it on their website. I mean, for years, it was their biggest program, funding intellectuals, cultivating like free-thinking, artistic people to be anti-communist. And there was a magazine, Partisan Review magazine. And that's where a lot of these big-name leftists in the United States, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, that's where they started out. And it was decades of covert funding and manipulation cultivating this. They hired a lot of Trotskyites. There were a lot of people who had been part of the Trotskyite movement in the United States who they didn't agree with Trotsky that the Soviet Union was still a deformed workers' state. They argued the Soviet Union was somehow state capitalist. Irving Kristol, Irving Howe, Mary McCarthy, a lot of these people, and a lot of them eventually became neocons, which is kind of hilarious. They gave birth to what we now call the synthetic left, but then they kept moving rightward and became like full-on neoconservatives after giving birth to the synthetic left. But Irving Howe, he never became a right-winger. He became the founder and the intellectual father of Democratic Socialists of America, Irving Howe. He basically admitted in one of his speeches, he said, as a socialist, I consider myself to be a partisan of the West in the Cold War. There's a very good book on this called the New York Intellectuals by Alan Wald. And it kind of goes over the history of these people that they were in New York City. They were from very poor families, and they were involved in the Communist Party and in other like radical socialist groups. But as World War II came, as they went to college and they got jobs, their views changed. As Israel was created, their views started to change. They became more and more anti-Soviet, more and more pro-imperialist. And eventually they laid the basis for what we call the synthetic left now. And then later they moved to become neocons. And that's kind of the trajectory of all of this. PBS loves these people, by the way. There's a guy you can watch called Arguing the World. And it's just a documentary about 4 of these guys.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, actually. That I couldn't remember the name of it, and that's why I didn't. And these people, they're all over the CIA, kind of, anything that's, PBS or museums in the United States or academia, all these things are kind of carefully nudged by the intelligence apparatus. And that's where you find these folks, right? These intellectuals, they're the kind of people that, they're not really books that Americans would really buy at Barnes & Noble. You know what I'm saying? Like average American. Yeah, yes.
It's like, oh, what are you reading? Oh, I'm reading Irving Kristol's great book about, how the Soviet Union is bureaucratic collectivist. And it's like you have to kind of nudge these kind of people if you want them to be famous. Somebody has to be pushing them. There has to be some big money.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you.
That's kind of the story of all of it.
That's a very good way of putting it, Caleb.
And that's sort of where I want to summarize everything is how currently that kind of social political zeitgeist and the funding behind it and what's pushing this ideology, how is that being used against you and other people who are actually trying to implement communism?
Yeah. Who are actually thinking along the lines of Marxism, Leninism, and ultimately and this is along those lines, probably one of the most interesting things about the social conservatism, the way that's arisen in a lot of these movements, that the movements stop really being about abolishing economic coercion that causes these ideologies to be necessary and starts keeping along with these ideological lines.